Donald Trump formally accepting the Republican nomination for president last night in Milwaukee. Joining us right now with his reaction to that speech and so much more is Arkansas GOP Senator Tom Cotton. Good morning to you. It was a rousing speech. It was a long speech. Curious what your initial reaction was to it, and not just what clearly the feeling was in the room, but what you think the feeling was around the country.
Well, Andrew, it was a great speech last night, especially when Donald Trump told the story of the assassination attempt on Saturday that he survived. I agree that the hand of God was on his shoulder when he turned and dodged that assassin's bullet. Sadly, it did kill one man who Donald Trump honored last night and injured others. The whole convention, though, was the best I've been to in my now, I guess, 4 conventions since I started in politics. Our party is unified. We're energetic. We're excited, not just about this election, but about the future of the country under President Trump. By contrast, you have the Democrats who are trying to mount a coup against their nominee.
You just said that you think the Democrats are trying to mount a coup against the nominee. It may be an unfair question to ask somebody who's on the other side of the Democratic Party in this regard, but is there somebody that you think the Democrats could mount as a nominee that would be competitive with the president?
I think the American people are ready to end 4 years of Democratic misrule, whether it's Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, or anyone else. They remember that under Donald Trump, things were good. We had stable prices, we had good high-paying jobs, our border was secure, and America was respected around the world. Over the last 3.5 years, everything's gone to hell. But, Andrew, the Democrats are not worried about Joe Biden's medical condition. They're not concerned that he's unfit for office now. They're only worried about losing their grip on power. All of these leaks coming from Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and others don't talk about Joe Biden's ability to serve as president now. They're only worried about whether they can win the election this fall. This is not about Joe Biden's medical or health condition. It's about the polls. And if they put Kamala Harris in his place, she's going to have a lot of questions to answer about what she knew about Joe Biden's condition and why she was out there saying he's smart as a whip behind closed doors and totally in command. But again, Andrew, the voters are supposed to make these decisions. The Democratic voters spoke loudly and clearly. Joe Biden was winning primaries just a few weeks before that debate happened. There's been no change from his condition when he was winning primaries, and people like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer were extolling him as sharp and in command. The only thing that has changed is that they can't keep it under wraps anymore. They can't maintain their conspiracy of silence since the debate, and now they're ready to throw him overboard in a coup simply to try to save their own skins.
Senator, let me ask you a different question about taxes and tariffs. We read about President Trump's plan this week to lower the corporate tax rate to 15%, but also to put on a slew of tariffs, which could act as a tax, if you will, on the entire country, potentially being remarkably inflationary. What's your reaction to that?
Andrew, this is a very unusual campaign. For the first time in more than 100 years, we have 2 presidents running against each other. We don't have to speculate about what they would do. We don't have to wonder if they'll keep their pledges and promises. We just have to look at the record. When Donald Trump was president, he had tariffs, we had tax cuts, we did not have inflation. The moment Joe Biden took office and started spending trillions of dollars that we don't have, we've had record high inflation. Families cannot afford to pay the rent and pay the bills and feed their kids. Again, it's a simple contrast between 2 records. Things were good under Donald Trump. American families have been struggling under Joe Biden.
But the question, though, on the tariff piece, though, is, at least my understanding of it, and maybe you have a different understanding, was those tariffs that the former president put in place when he was president were relatively targeted. We actually did a segment on this earlier today, around washing machines and other types of big appliances. The kind of tariffs that I think we're talking about, that the former president's talking about in a new term, would be much broader based and may very well act as a tax. That's what we're talking about. Sort of you lower the corporate tax on one side, but then in some ways you're raising the tax, if you will, on the other, and it actually is broader based. No?
Well, Andrew, the simple fact is we had tariffs. And now there are other sectors in which China cheats as well, in which tariffs are called for too. I would also note that Joe Biden, by and large, has not repealed any of those tariffs. He hasn't enforced them the same way Donald Trump did and the way Donald Trump would again. That's not what drove inflation. What drove inflation is Joe Biden and the Democrats spending trillions of dollars we didn't have, of throttling American energy production and putting a wet blanket of regulations across this economy. President Trump, like he did 4 years ago, or in his first four-year term, will reverse those policies. We'll have stable prices. We'll have a healthy, growing economy.
Let me ask you about the Secret Service situation, because you made some provocative comments about what you think should happen. At this point, what do you think should happen to the head of the Secret Service, and even more broadly in terms of the security for the former president and presidents more generally?
Well, Andrew, I'm not sure what comments you're saying are provocative. Kim Cheadle should resign. There was an obvious failure at the event last Saturday where President Trump faced an attempted assassin's bullet, and she still hasn't taken responsibility. It's one thing to have a failure on your watch when you're executive. It's another thing to start making excuses and refuse to take responsibility. She's blamed it on local law enforcement or on a sloped roof, for goodness sakes. So that the men and women who jumped up on that stage to protect President Trump and who are willing to take a bullet for him and who defend other people all day long, Joe Biden and his family, deserve much better leadership than what they've gotten from Kim Cheadle. And the agency needs better leadership than it's had for some time.